Imagine a time when the United States was still young, its borders uncertain, and its rivers flowing quietly through forests and open fields. The air smells of damp earth and distant wood smoke, and small towns rest peacefully along winding waterways, their streets bathed in soft sunlight or flickering lantern light at dusk. In this gentle, drifting world, a man moves quietly through the frontier, a former vice president, known to many, understood by few. He carries letters, questions, and intentions that are folded tightly within him, like secrets tucked away in the folds of a coat. Travelers whisper about him, settlers watch him from a distance, and yet he passes calmly, leaving only a faint ripple across the river and in the minds of those who see him. Who is he? What is he planning? And why does he journey westward, away from the capital and the eyes of the nation? Tonight, we will follow his quiet steps, drifting along the rivers, through sleepy towns, and across wide, open lands, uncovering the soft mysteries of his journey. Settle into a comfortable space, take a slow breath, and let the calm river of history carry you along. There is no rush here, just the gentle unfolding of a story that whispers softly through time. In the quiet years after the American Revolution, when the country was still young and unsure of its own shape, the land carried a certain softness to it. The forests felt thicker, the rivers seemed slower, and long stretches of open space stretched between scattered towns like gentle breaths between sentences. And in this early landscape, where people whispered more than they shouted, the story of Aaron Burr's western wanderings quietly began. It started with the simple sound of footsteps leaving the polished floors of the nation's capital behind. Burr had once stood near the center of attention, a man known in every room he entered, but now he walked away from those bright halls with little more than a suitcase and a thoughtful look in his eyes. You can imagine him moving slowly down a long, shaded road, the dust lifting around his boots, his mind turning quietly, almost as if he were trying to slip unnoticed into the wide spaces of the American frontier. The early 1800s were a peaceful time on the surface, but they carried a certain restlessness underneath. Rivers cut long paths through untouched wilderness, and small settlements sat like scattered lanterns glowing faintly in the dark. The sound of water moving against a wooden boat was one of the era's quiet songs, just as the soft murmur of distant conversations carried through the still air. Travelers followed these paths, letting the rivers guide them, and it was along these calm waters that Burr chose to drift. As he stepped aboard a small flatboat heading west, the boards creaked softly beneath him. The boat was simple, little more than planks, a small shelter, and a lantern that swayed gently with the movement of the river. Burr found a place to sit near the edge, where he could feel the cool splash of water brushing the wooden hull. The breeze smelled of wet leaves, damp soil, and a hint of smoke from some faraway cabin. He seemed comfortable there, away from the noise of political arguments and busy streets. Out on the river, everything felt slower, and the world seemed to breathe at an easier pace. People along the frontier recognized him, of course. His face was familiar, even out here where strangers were a common sight. But they didn't approach him with loud questions or bold greetings. Instead, they watched him with quiet curiosity, wondering why a man who had once held such high office was drifting west like an ordinary traveler. Sometimes someone would nod politely from the riverbank, or lift a hand in greeting as their own boat passed by, but Burr's replies were gentle, simple smiles, small gestures, the kind one gives when one is thinking deeply about something else, and perhaps he was thinking deeply. That was part of the quiet mystery that began to settle around him, like mist gathering along the river in the early morning. He carried letters tucked into his coat, folded neatly and sealed with care. He carried thoughts no one else could quite read, no matter how closely they watched him. Some said he was exploring land opportunities. Others whispered that he was meeting people for reasons no one fully understood. But out here, where the land stretched so wide and people lived by the rhythm of sun and seasons, those whispers felt more like drifting questions than true concerns. At night, the river grew even quieter. The sky opened wide, filled with stars unbroken by city lights. Burr would sit by the dim glow of his lantern, the flame flickering gently as he wrote notes or simply stared into the distance. The soft scrape of his quill against paper was a lonely sound, but not a sad one, more like the peaceful rhythm of someone trying to put wandering thoughts into place. Sometimes the only other sound was the slow, steady movement of water under the boat, like a long sigh stretching through the night. The frontier towns he visited were small, warm, and often sleepy places. Wooden houses lined dusty paths, and the scent of fresh bread, river mud, and wood smoke drifted through the air. People spoke in soft voices in the evenings, sitting on porches with lanterns glowing beside them. Children chased fireflies, and dogs lay curled near doorsteps, watching strangers with half-open eyes. Burr would walk through these places with a calm, steady pace, stopping to share a meal or exchange a polite greeting. He never hurried, and he never seemed out of place, not even in the smallest, quietest corners of the West. Some of the locals would later say they sensed something about him, a purpose, or maybe just an unusual sense of direction. He asked gentle questions about land, rivers, and settlements, listening carefully but never revealing much about himself. It wasn't the kind of secrecy that brought fear. Instead, it felt like the private stillness of someone carrying a personal plan, or perhaps a hope that wasn't ready to be spoken aloud. People weren't sure what it was, but they could feel the faint outline of a mystery there, like a shape forming slowly through fog. The more Burr traveled, the more that sense followed him. A former vice president moving alone through the frontier was unusual, but not alarming. There was no rush in his steps, no tension in his shoulders. He moved like a man taking a long breath, as if the vastness of the West offered him something the crowded political world never could: quiet space to think, or maybe to begin something new. As the river carried him onward, the landscape slowly changed, dense forests giving way to wide open fields, and fields slowly rising toward distant, gentle hills. Herds of cattle grazed near the water's edge. Hunters moved through the trees with careful steps. And every so often, Burr would pause in his travels, sit beneath a large tree, and look out across the horizon with a thoughtful expression, as if measuring the distance between what he had been and what he might become. Yet even with all the calm, there was something faint beneath the surface. A slight uncertainty, a question waiting to be answered. It wasn't frightening or dark, just unspoken. Like a story that hadn't yet revealed its direction. Burr rarely spoke of his plans, and when he did, the details were vague, shaped more by suggestion than by clear description. And so the people he met remembered him as polite, quiet, and somehow, gently enigmatic. The days continued in this soft rhythm. River travel by sunlight, simple meals in small taverns, long conversations that drifted like the current, touching on everything except the one thing people wanted to know most. And Burr, for his part, seemed content to keep his thoughts folded neatly like the letters he carried, tucked away until the time was right. The West, after all, was a place where dreams could take shape slowly, like morning light spreading across the land. And perhaps that was what he was looking for, a space where an idea could grow without interruption. Or perhaps he was simply searching for quiet. It was hard to say, as this first chapter of his journey settles into your mind, let it rest there gently, like a small lantern glowing at dusk. The shapes of this story are only beginning to appear. The river still has a long way to go, and the land ahead holds more than open fields and whispering forests. There are people waiting, letters to be delivered, and questions that will slowly rise as Burr travels farther west. The next stretch of Burr's journey began in the soft light of early morning, when the sky was still pale and the horizon held that faint, bluish glow that appears before the sun fully wakes. A thin mist floated above the river, curling gently around the boat as it rocked in the slow-moving water. It was the kind of morning where every sound felt softened, where footsteps seemed quieter, and the world felt like it was waiting, listening, as if something subtle and important was about to unfold. Burr rose before most of the crew, stepping quietly from his small sleeping area to the edge of the boat. The boards were cool beneath his boots. The mist brushed against his face like breath. He rested one hand on the railing and watched the river drift past, smooth and silent, carrying small flecks of leaves and twigs along its wide, patient path. From somewhere deep within the woods, a bird called, long and low, as though greeting him alone. This early stillness had become something Burr valued more and more as he traveled west. It steadied him, giving him the quiet he needed to think. He would often stand like this for long minutes, letting the slow rhythm of the river guide his mind. There were no guards, no officials, no reporters to question him. Just the faint creak of the boat and the distant crackle of the crew starting a small morning fire to heat water, as the sun finally began to rise. Its warm light filtered through the mist, revealing the shapes of the shoreline, tall trees with heavy branches, patches of deep green, and here and there the outline of a small cabin or a cluster of smoke rising from an unseen camp. The frontier felt open, unhurried, and welcoming in its own quiet way. It was a place where stories grew slowly, shaped more by gentle conversation around campfires than by anything written in official documents. After breakfast, Burr stepped off the boat at a small landing. The settlement nearby was little more than a few wooden houses, a modest trading post, and a path that wound up the hillside. Chickens pecked at the ground. A dog stretched lazily in the sunlight. People greeted him with nods and soft smiles, recognizing him but treating him without ceremony. Out here, reputation mattered, but so did the simple rule of neighborly calm. He spent the morning speaking with a local landowner who had brought out hand-drawn maps, laid across a table smoothed by time. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded a little, but the outlines of rivers, hills, and fields were still clear. Burr leaned over the maps with quiet interest, tracing the shapes with one finger. He asked questions, gentle ones, never pressing or urgent, about soil, water routes, and who owned which parcels of land. The landowner described the area with pride. You could hear the affection in his voice as he talked about how the river flooded in the spring, how certain hills caught the first light of dawn, how traders brought stories from faraway places. Burr listened closely, offering thoughtful comments but revealing almost nothing about what he intended to do with the information. People enjoyed talking to him, though they never quite knew what he was thinking. He had a way of making others feel heard, even when he kept his own plans tucked away. And perhaps that was part of why the West suited him so well. Out here, people had their own mysteries, private dreams, quiet ambitions, unspoken hopes. Burr simply blended into that subtle culture of withheld thoughts. When he returned to the river later that day, the sun was higher and the mist had burned away. The water glistened in soft waves, and the breeze carried the faint scent of pine and wild grass. Burr stepped aboard with a light nod to the crew and settled near the bow, watching the shoreline slip past. The river was wider here, showing long stretches of muddy banks where deer sometimes wandered down for a drink. As they traveled, Burr occasionally reached into his coat, pulling from it one of the letters he carried. He would break the seal with careful fingers, read the contents, then fold it again with the same steady patience, slipping it back into its place. The letters were from people he trusted, contacts from his political life. Military associates, men with land, money, and influence. But he never read them aloud. And he never explained to the crew why certain messages made him nod slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. One night, after the crew had settled and the lanterns dimmed, Burr sat near the stern of the boat with a man who had joined them in the last town, a former soldier with a calm, observant nature. The two spoke quietly, voices barely above the whisper of the water. Anyone listening would have heard only fragments, mentions of territories, Spanish lands, opportunities in the southwest. Nothing alarming. Nothing certain. Just the soft conversation of two men thinking about the possibilities of an open continent. But even in the gentle dark, there was something about the talk that carried a faint edge, not sharp enough to disturb, just enough to stir curiosity. Burr spoke with a calm confidence, describing the West as a place where new ideas could take root, where old political divisions held less power. His companion listened, clearly intrigued, though it was impossible to tell how much he truly understood of Burr's deeper meaning. As days turned into weeks, Burr's path continued westward. He visited plantations where grand trees shaded wide porches and the air smelled of river mud and damp wood. He rode horseback along narrow trails where the canopy above filtered the sunlight into soft, shifting patterns. He spoke with farmers, traders, and adventurers, all of them part of the slow-moving life of the frontier, and through it all, the mystery followed him. Not a dark or unsettling mystery, but the kind that floats quietly beneath the surface, like a submerged log the river carries from one bend to the next. Something forming. Something not yet spoken. Even those who liked him sensed it. They would say later, in that thoughtful way frontier people often spoke, that Burr moved with purpose, though no one could say exactly what that purpose was. One evening, as the boat glided past a long stretch of golden reeds glowing in the sunset, Burr sat alone near the bow. The sky above him shifted from orange to purple, and birds flew low across the water. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, lost in thought. There was something almost peaceful about the way he stared at the horizon, as if the river itself was guiding him toward an answer he had been waiting for. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of wet plants and distant smoke. The crew prepared their small camp for the night, moving slowly, without disturbing the quiet mood that had settled over the group. Burr finally lifted his head, taking a long, deep breath, as though letting the river fill him with renewed certainty. He did not speak, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a decision made in silence. The river flowed on, steady and unhurried. And the story flowed with it, carrying Burr deeper into the West and deeper into the quiet question of what he hoped to create there. As this part of his journey settles into your thoughts, let it rest softly, like ripples fading across a calm surface. The days ahead will bring new meetings, new letters, and new hints of what Burr might be planning. Nothing loud. Nothing sudden. Just the gentle unfolding of a story still half hidden beneath the drifting current. As Burr continued westward, the soft rhythm of the river carried him toward quieter towns, each one resting along the shoreline like small, forgotten echoes of a growing nation. The days felt gentle and long, wrapped in a warm haze of sunlight that shimmered on the water. But somewhere in that calm, something new and almost imperceptible began to drift in the air, something like a whisper carried between strangers, or a faint question floating just beneath ordinary conversation. It started in a small riverside settlement where the houses leaned slightly toward the water, their wooden boards weathered by years of wind and flood. The people there spoke softly, tending their gardens, mending nets, and watching travelers pass with the slow curiosity that frontier life often encouraged. When Burr stepped off the boat to rest for a night, he was welcomed with the usual polite nods and quiet greetings. But behind those nods, something flickered, something observant, almost cautious, though no one would have been able to explain why. He stayed in a modest inn overlooking the river, where the scent of baked cornbread filled the evening air and the sound of boots on the porch settled into a steady, familiar rhythm. Burr ate a simple meal and exchanged friendly words with the innkeeper, who listened with interest as he spoke about the land he had seen farther east. But the innkeeper's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than usual, as if trying to guess the shape of Burr's thoughts. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to show that quiet questions were beginning to form. The next morning, as Burr prepared to continue his journey, a small group of men stood near the boat landing. They murmured among themselves, speaking softly so as not to intrude. Their tone wasn't suspicious, just curious, in that hesitant way people speak when they're piecing together fragments of something unclear. "That's him, isn't it?" One of them murmured. "Aye," another replied gently. "The gentleman from the capital. Traveling alone, so they say. What's he after out here? Hard to tell. But he asks about land. And rivers. And, well, big things." Their voices drifted toward the water, blending with the sound of the river's slow movement. Burr didn't seem bothered. He had become accustomed to the attention that followed him, even in the most remote corners of the frontier. He simply nodded politely as he passed them, stepping onto the boat with a calm, measured step, but the slight ripple of rumor didn't stay behind. It drifted with him. By the next settlement, another cluster of simple homes shaded by tall cottonwoods, the whisper had grown a little stronger. People there had already heard that a former vice president was traveling the river, asking thoughtful questions about the West. Some said he was looking for land. Others claimed he was consulting old military contacts. A few even wondered whether he was preparing for something larger, something that couldn't quite be named, yet none of the speculation carried alarm. It was more like the gentle hum of a story beginning to grow, a story told by lantern light in the early evening, when neighbors gathered outside to rest and talk. And because life on the frontier often felt isolated, people enjoyed having something new to wonder about, something to break the endless sameness of days filled with farming, trading, and survival. Burr, for his part, spoke with his usual calm politeness. He met with traders, listened to old soldiers' stories, and spent long hours studying maps of river routes and land claims. In each conversation, he kept his tone light and his words measured, as if avoiding anything that might reveal more than he intended. Sometimes he spoke of new possibilities, of how the West held a freedom the East no longer offered. Sometimes he mentioned Spanish territories far to the southwest, describing them almost as if they were part of some distant dream. People listened, intrigued. His voice was smooth and thoughtful, the kind that made others lean in without realizing they had done so. And though he never said anything outright, his words carried hints, suggestions, possibilities that felt larger than anything visible on the surface. It was enough to make even the quietest listener wonder. The rumors traveled not because Burr sought attention, but because he moved with a sense of purpose so calm and steady that people couldn't help but notice. He spoke like someone imagining a different kind of future, one not yet shaped or defined. And on the frontier, where life was still rough and uncertain, talk of new beginnings held a certain power. One evening, as the boat approached a small port surrounded by rolling fields, Burr stood at the bow with his coat pulled tight against a rising wind. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the water, and the last light of the day caught the edges of the clouds in faint pink and gold. He looked thoughtful, almost serene. As if absorbing every detail of the landscape, every hill, every bend in the river, every distant cabin where lanterns flickered like soft stars. Behind him, 2 members of the crew spoke quietly. "He's planning something," one of them said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what makes you think so?" "He listens too closely. Asks too carefully. You can tell when a man is feeling the land beneath his feet. Not like a traveler, but like someone imagining what it could be." The second man considered this, then nodded slowly. "Maybe so," he murmured. "But whatever it is, he carries it with such calm. Like he knows the river will show him when the time is right." Burr didn't hear their conversation. Or perhaps he did, but paid it little mind. He continued to gaze across the fading horizon, his expression thoughtful, almost reflective, and then something small shifted in the air. Not a sound. Not a word. More like a feeling, the slightest sense that the curiosity around him had begun to stretch beyond simple interest. That shadows were lengthening, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggested the story was beginning to deepen. Rumors, after all, have a way of changing shape as they travel. They begin as gentle questions, then take on new colors as they pass from person to person. By the time Burr reached the next town, the whispers had grown into quiet speculations about alliances, letters, and meetings no one fully understood. People watched him with warm courtesy, but their eyes held the faint shine of wonder, and perhaps a touch of uncertainty. Still, nothing loud disturbed the peaceful western air. The river remained calm. The town stayed friendly. The days moved slowly, like drifting clouds. Yet beneath it all, the quiet mystery surrounding Burr thickened, soft as mist, subtle as twilight, and impossible to ignore. The days grew warmer as Burr drifted deeper into the west. The river widened, curving through stretches of open country where tall grasses swayed in soft waves and birds circled lazily overhead. The air carried a faint scent of sun-warmed soil and distant wood smoke, the kind that lingered long after evening fell. And though the landscape looked peaceful, the slow-spreading whispers that followed Burr seemed to settle into the very breeze, traveling just as easily as the current that guided his boat. At last, he reached a place that felt slightly different from the river towns he had visited before. It was a settlement tucked between gentle hills, broad, rounded slopes covered with wildflowers and scattered groves of young maples. The buildings here were sturdier, their wooden beams thick and well-fitted, as though the residents had taken extra care in shaping their little corner of the frontier. A wide road cut through the center of town, and wagons creaked slowly over it, leaving soft tracks in the dust. Burr stepped off the boat with his usual calm, and the people greeted him politely, though with just a trace more attention than before. Word had reached them, rumors carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering soldiers, so by the time he arrived, they already knew a little of him. Yet their curiosity wasn't sharp. It was more like a warm hum of interest, the kind that pulls neighbors to their porches when something new comes drifting into their quiet lives. A local official invited Burr to stay in a hilltop house overlooking the settlement. The building wasn't grand, but it held a certain charm: broad windows, a deep porch, and a view of the river winding like a silver ribbon below. Burr accepted with a polite nod, and as he walked up the gentle slope toward the house, he seemed to relax slightly, as though the open view offered a clearer space for his mind. Inside, he found the rooms modest and neat, with the scent of pinewood lingering faintly in the air. A map of the region hung on one wall, hand-drawn and carefully detailed. He stood before it for a long moment, his eyes tracing the river routes, the hills, the distant Spanish borderlands that stretched far beyond the edge of the parchment. The official noticed his interest and approached quietly. "Beautiful country, isn't it?" he said, keeping his voice gentle. "It is," Burr replied, still studying the map. "A land with room for many possibilities." The official nodded, though a flicker of curiosity stirred behind his eyes. That evening, a small gathering was held in Burr's honor. Not a grand event, just a handful of locals, landowners, merchants, former officers who had settled after years of service. They sat together on the porch as lanterns glowed softly in the falling dusk. Fireflies drifted through the air, blinking in slow patterns, and the faint night breeze carried the scent of blooming clover. The conversation began lightly, with talk of weather, crops, and the latest town improvements. Burr listened with genuine interest, leaning back in his chair, the faint golden light catching the thoughtful lines of his face. But as the evening went on, the discussion shifted, gently, as if carried by an unseen current. One of the former officers began speaking about his time along the Spanish frontier, describing the quiet tension between overlapping claims and the uncertainty of distant borders. Another mentioned the growing restlessness among settlers who felt isolated from decisions made in faraway cities. A merchant added that the West seemed to hold a certain energy now, people thinking differently, imagining futures not tied to the established patterns of the East. Burr asked questions here and there, always softly. He spoke not of plans, but of ideas, broad, almost philosophical musings about the nature of land, governance, and opportunity. His voice remained slow and smooth, never hinting at anything ambitious. Yet each word seemed carefully chosen, like threads woven into a pattern so subtle only the attentive might notice. Those gathered around him leaned in without realizing it. The hills around the porch darkened as night settled fully. Crickets filled the air with their steady rhythm. A candle flickered on the table, its flame bending gently with each breath of wind. Burr rested his hands on the wooden armrests, looking from face to face with a quiet, steady gaze. "When you stand out there," he said softly, "on a rise overlooking the river, can you feel how open everything is? How the land stretches with possibility?" Several nodded. The officer who had served on the frontier let out a thoughtful breath. "Sometimes," he murmured, "it feels like a place waiting for a new kind of story." Burr smiled, not a broad smile, but a small one, shaped by understanding more than agreement. "Perhaps so," he replied. "And all stories need people who see what others overlook." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a hint of intent. But it was enough to leave an impression, one that sat quietly in the minds of those who heard it, settling there like a seed waiting for time and warmth. As the evening went on, the group shared more stories, some from their pasts, others from the ever-growing frontier. They spoke of hardships, hopes, and the strange comfort of living far from the noise of Eastern politics. Through it all, Burr listened, occasionally adding a gentle comment that revealed just enough insight to keep curiosity alive. Later, after the others had gone home and the lanterns had been extinguished, Burr remained on the porch alone. He sat quietly, his silhouette outlined by the soft glow of moonlight. The hills beyond him lay in calm darkness, rolling gently like sleeping animals beneath the night sky. The river shimmered faintly below, reflecting the pale streaks of starlight. He reached into his coat and drew out a letter, one he had not yet shown anyone. The seal cracked softly as he opened it. In the faint moonlight, he read the words once, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into its place. Whatever message the letter carried, it did not disturb the calm of his expression. If anything, it seemed to confirm something he had already accepted. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The air smelled of grass and dew, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, its voice long and low. The world felt still, as though holding a quiet breath. The next morning, Burr met privately with two men from the gathering, one a skilled surveyor, the other a former officer known for his reliability. The conversation was held indoors, behind a closed door, though no raised voices or suspicious tones disturbed the tranquility of the house. Their discussion remained calm, thoughtful, measured. Maps were spread across the table. Notes were taken. Questions were asked, and though nothing in their conversation suggested urgency or secret ambition, the meeting left the house with a faint sense of purpose lingering in the air. Outside, the town continued its peaceful morning routine. Children chased a stray dog down the street. A farmer rode past slowly on horseback. Women hung linens in the soft sunlight, the cloth fluttering gently like pale flags in the breeze. No one suspected that the meeting had added a new, nearly invisible thread to Burr's growing web of quiet connections. By midday, Burr was back on the river, the boat gliding away from the hilltop town as easily as a leaf slipping downstream. He stood once more at the bow, the wind lifting the ends of his coat, his gaze fixed not on the water but on the western horizon. Behind him, the rumors shifted again. They were still gentle, still small, but now they carried a little more shape, like clouds beginning to form into patterns across the sky. Stories of meetings, of maps, of letters. Nothing certain, but enough to make people wonder. As Burr watched the river unwind before him, a faint look of resolve settled across his features. The west stretched wide, and something within him seemed to stretch toward it, steady, patient, and quietly determined. The river continued its slow winding through the wide, open lands of the west, carrying Burr gently forward, as it had done for so many weeks. The morning mist rose from the water in soft, curling wisps, catching the early sunlight and scattering it into pale gold across the surface. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, fresh grass, and distant wood smoke from small, scattered settlements. Burr stood at the bow of his boat, one hand resting lightly on the railing, as though simply letting the river guide him. By now, the quiet curiosity that had followed him through the frontier had begun to settle into history. Letters had been sent, meetings had been held, and stories whispered in the shade of frontier trees and in the glow of lanterns had slowly drifted eastward. Some people still wondered about the meaning of it all, but Burr himself carried on with calm composure, revealing little, speaking only when necessary, always measured and thoughtful. His journey west had not led to the formation of a new nation or a grand private empire, as rumors had suggested. Instead, Burr returned to a quieter existence, wandering the country in a reflective way, moving with soft purpose through towns and along rivers, sometimes visiting old friends, sometimes leaving behind notes or letters that hinted at plans long settled in his own mind. There was no great upheaval, no sudden revelation, only the gentle, persistent presence of a man who had once stood at the center of the nation and now moved quietly at its edges. People who met him in these later years remembered the calmness that seemed to settle over any room he entered. He walked through streets and markets with measured steps, spoke in the same soft, steady tone he had carried through the frontier, and offered polite, thoughtful questions to anyone willing to share a moment of conversation. Nothing in him suggested the quiet turbulence of political ambition or secret schemes. It was as if the river itself had taught him to move slowly, to let time shape events instead of forcing them into hurried action. In towns where children ran laughing along dusty streets, Burr was remembered as a polite stranger, almost a figure from a storybook, a man who had wandered from the East with questions and letters, and who left behind only the impression of careful observation and gentle curiosity. Settlers and neighbors spoke of him in the evenings as they gathered on porches or by fires, telling the story of the former vice president who had passed through, not as a hero, not as a villain, but simply as a traveler whose quiet presence carried weight. As he aged, Burr spent long hours reflecting on his life. Some days he wandered along riverbanks, watching the sun rise over the hills. Other times he visited old friends in small towns, sharing calm conversations that never ventured into the drama of politics. The world moved on around him, the nation growing and changing, but Burr moved at a slower pace. Matching the rhythm of rivers and forests, the cadence of quiet towns and open fields, and yet, the story he left behind held a certain soft mystery, gentle enough not to disturb, intriguing enough to linger. The whispers of what might have been traveled quietly through history, carried in the margins of letters, tucked into old maps, and hinted at in the memories of those who met him along the frontier. It was a story that didn't shout, but one that continued to drift, slowly, like a leaf floating on calm water. In the end, Burr's western journey became part of the soft, quiet fabric of early American history. Not a tale of great battles or loud declarations, but of measured steps. Thoughtful letters, gentle curiosity, and the still, reflective moments that allowed history itself to breathe. He faded from public life, not with fanfare, but with the calm dignity of someone who had sought to explore possibilities, to understand the land, and to follow a path quietly his own. As the sun sets on this part of the story, imagine the river continuing its journey, carrying Burr's quiet presence into the distance. The hills and forests fade into a gentle twilight, the stars slowly appear, and the whispers of history settle softly around you. This chapter closes with calm reflection, leaving space for imagination to drift, for thought to wander, and for the gentle mysteries of the past to rest alongside you. The river of time slows now, and our journey through the quiet corners of history drifts gently to its rest for tonight. The towns fade into soft shadows, the forests grow still, and the faint glow of lanterns along the frontier slips quietly into darkness. We've walked beside rivers and over hills, listened to whispered letters, and traced the gentle footsteps of those who shaped the past. The air is calm, the stars above stretch wide across the night sky, and the soft pulse of history settles into a gentle rhythm. Let your thoughts float on this slow current, drifting over distant hills, past quiet towns, and along the vast, open spaces where stories of long ago still linger. There is no hurry here. Only the calm hush of memory, the soft echo of footsteps that came before us, and the gentle promise of tomorrow's tale. Rest now, as the world breathes softly around you. Close your eyes and let the whispers of history lull you, carrying you toward sleep and quiet dreams. Good night, time traveler.